Hello and welcome to HCI 509, Research Methods and Statistical Analysis. In this lecture, Lecture 17, we'll talk about the research protocol. So let's get started. As you recall, SUNY Oswego has a Human Subjects Committee, or an HSC. The purpose of this committee is to ensure that researchers conduct ethically responsible experiments with human subjects. And as researchers, we need to get approval from them before we start our work. We need to provide the committee with a clear explanation of what our experiment's about. Now, the committee is typically made up of people from different backgrounds. So when I was part of the HSC, we had people from psychology, from computer science, and from other fields like sociology. Each of those have terminology that they use that may differ from what we have in HCI. For example, when I was a PhD student, most of the members were part of the medical school, and I was part of computer science. And unfortunately, terminology that I thought was well understood was foreign to them. So I had to go back and revise my document a few times when I began writing research proposals. Details are important, but we have to be careful not to put too much information because the evaluators are more or less doing this as a service role, meaning they're not full-time evaluators. They're professors who have other responsibilities. And the more information that you give them, the slower the process can be. For example, if you give a lot of references, or if you go into far too much detail, it's important to know how high or how low to fly in many cases. So at SUNY Oswego, the review process usually involves submitting a few files. First of all, your training certificates for all the researchers involved, not just the principal investigator, but everyone. The research protocol, which we'll talk about here, informed consent, as well as a recruitment script, debriefing script, and other relevant documents, such as forms and questionnaires if you plan to use them. Some steps or documents may change for some HSCs, but the process is essentially the same. I know at my university in Colorado, we also have a process, but our process isn't as tight as it is at SUNY Oswego. When I was part of the University of Iowa, for example, it was far more rigorous because most of the people going through IRB were doing things in the fields of psychology or medicine, and that involves a lot of rigor because the university doesn't want to get sued. Now, here's a suggestion. To better understand this lecture, it's advisable that you download the research protocol form and keep it open. The research protocol form can be found on the Human Subjects Committee webpage at SUNY Oswego. In particular, if you're filling out the form for your project, use this lecture to better understand what's being asked in each section. So let's talk about the research protocol step by step. The first part of the research protocol is the project information. So you want to have a title for your project that's meaningful. It's not too long or too short, and it's created with some kind of consultation with your co-investigators. You want the start date to be a while after the submission date. At SUNY Oswego, 2 to 3 weeks is okay. When I did a deception study, it took almost 9 months to get approval because it had to go to a full board meeting. You can kind of gauge whether it's going to be a controversial submission or not. In most cases with HCI, they're not going to be very controversial. So 2 to 3 weeks should be okay. The location might be online if you're doing something using an online questionnaire, or it might be at SUNY Oswego. The location is important because wherever you do the study, you have to have permission from some responsible party there. So if it's a shopping mall or an airport that you're doing some kind of study, you have to have some kind of letter or proof that you have approval to do it at that facility. Next, we want to put down the principal investigator, or PI. This is the main person responsible for the experiment. So with HCI projects, this will be the student, and you can see the information that they want you to provide. Sometimes you'll have a co-investigator, and usually this is your supervisor. In a class project, for example, in HCI 521, the whole team of students would be co-investigators. And you can see they have additional information down at a website at the bottom here. Let's talk about the main sections of the research protocol now. The first section is the overview and hypothesis. This section is going to require you to think a little bit. You want to put the aim, the objectives, and the purpose of the research that you're proposing. So in an HCI project, usually these elements are defined in the project proposal written by the student with their supervisor, which is a separate document. You want to avoid wordy explanations, jargon, or have too many references because that will slow down the process. They may overwhelm the IRB evaluator or make it difficult for them to understand the research or experiment that you're proposing. However, you can include the research questions or hypotheses or variables that you plan to study with this particular research proposal. Make sure that they're not confidential, because if they're confidential, you don't want to disclose them even in this document, because eventually it will be a public document. In section 2, part A, we need to talk about the human subjects. So we're going to describe the human subjects, which may involve which age group or demographic we're going to get these participants from, any particular characteristics pertaining to the study. So you can see here there's some protected classes: pregnant women, individuals with disabilities, other vulnerable groups, such as people who may have dementia, children who are under 18 years of age, and then prisoners. And then if applicable, you have to describe the reasoning behind using these protected classes. So, for example, if the scope of your study was to see how prisoners use technology in a prison, well, it would only make sense to use prisoners. It wouldn't make sense to use people just that you'd pull from the street, because prisoners may be a separate demographic than what you'd find in the general population. So they require some special care. You have to have a reason for using that protected class. In part B, you're going to identify the sources and location from where you're going to recruit your subjects for research. And it's helpful to have some kind of language or materials that you're going to be using to recruit these subjects. So if you're doing it by email, how are you going to get these email addresses? Here's a couple of examples. And if there's a separate document with a recruitment script, you want to make sure that you include it here, because you don't want to use coercion to get people to do things for your study or make promises you can't fulfill. So part C asks if subjects are going to be compensated. And it's not obligatory. In fact, many researchers just don't have it. In a lot of cases for studies, you may find them in graduate school where the instructor's offering extra credit as a form of compensation. However, if there's compensation, the committee has to be aware, because it may introduce biases or even be unethical. I'll give you an example. I was doing a study that compared people I hired from a crowdsourcing website against people I hired as graduate students when I was a PhD student. So I offered the graduate students $10 to do the study, but crowdsourcing, that would be a lot of money. So typically they're paid a small fraction of that to do a particular task. So I only offered $1, and the IRB flagged that and said that there would be biases because the compensation wasn't equal. So to justify that, I had to show that the compensation for crowdsourcing people that I had as subjects, that was the norm for that particular type of role or that task. And for people I hired on campus, the $10 was appropriate and typical for the amount of effort in the task. And they went ahead and allowed me to do it, even though the compensation wasn't equal. Also, if you're trying to study if different amounts of compensation provide better incentives, then obviously the amount of compensation is going to differ. Part D of Section 2 asks for you to provide letters to support the approval of doing research outside of SUNY Oswego. And of course, if it's online, you don't have to have a letter. But for example, if you were recruiting and performing this in an Apple store, you want to have some kind of approval from the Apple Store manager that says they're aware that you're doing this research and they agree that it's okay. So, for example, if you're in a museum, you want to get somebody at the museum who has the authority to give this kind of letter. In section 3, we talk about the procedures, and this is kind of a more detailed aspect of what you're going to be doing. So you might include the experiment script. So this is a step-by-step guide of everything that's going to be done in the experiment to guarantee that all the participants receive the same instructions and treatment. Remember, we talked about systematic bias, and we talked about how you have two different experimenters, and one gives a different set of instructions than the other, and how that might introduce bias. Well, the step-by-step guide should be created as a way to counteract that systematic bias. And this is a good thing to include here. So you also want to talk about the measurements, in other words, the dependent variables, and what instruments you're going to be using to collect that information. So if the measurement or instrument is invasive, we have to talk about how dangerous it can be. So for example, if you had a way of collecting blood pressure, or if you had some kind of EKG system that you were going to hook up to monitor someone, we want to talk about this in this section. And you also want to talk about how it's not going to be a problem. In other words, the technology is not going to penetrate the participant's skin, or it's not going to have any kind of long-term effects. And it also should mention any attached documents pertaining to instruments that will be used during the experiment, such as researcher scripts, questionnaires, post-participation surveys, and so on. Next is the section on benefits. And benefits is one that students often struggle with, because when we think about benefits, you're thinking about like curing cancer or having some kind of huge breakthrough. But in many cases, the benefits are far more subtle than that. So every research has benefits, either for the participants or for science. So a common benefit for participants is learning about a new technology or a field of knowledge, or having experience using a new cutting-edge technology. The benefits for human or scientific knowledge should be very explicit in the research's aim. In other words, if you can't relate the benefits, it's going to be difficult to convince the committee that what you're doing has any meaning or purpose. We can also talk about the macro contribution of the research. Sometimes we have to step back and think about, what is this doing for HCI or for usability in general? So here's an example of a benefit. So if you're testing a new type of interface, the design could advance the knowledge in HCI of how people interact with such interfaces. So next comes the risks. And you can see here they've got some check boxes of some risks, and you would include one or more of these. So interviewing, photographing, or filming participants may cause temporary embarrassment or even alter their behavior because of the thought that they're being watched. We talked about this with the Hawthorne effect. The risks are mostly in leaking identifiable information, which could cause long-term embarrassment or even more serious consequences. So if you film somebody doing something that was really embarrassing for them, and this got out, it could affect their ability to get a job later, or if they said something, it may impact. We all know how social media has derailed many a career later on. Just imagine if they were participating in your study and this came out. So we have to identify these kinds of risks. However, most studies in HCI are low risk, but we have to recognize when these risks are possible. We try to minimize the risks to protect participants, which is really a sign of respect towards our participants. Some minor risks that we could encounter in HCI are physical fatigue from repetitive movements, mental fatigue, such as experimenting with a long duration, and eye strain. One way of minimizing the common minor risks is offering breaks to participants. And this may or may not be possible depending on what type of experiment you're doing. If you're doing something where you're testing the duration of a task over, say, a longer period, you can't give a break and have some measurable data. So, for example, if you have the total completion time of many tasks in a row, then it's not possible to have them take a break during the middle of that. However, it's important to let participants know that they can discontinue their participation at any time if they feel uncomfortable. Very few people will with most studies, but it's important for them to know that they have that option. So deception is not common in HCI research, and really it can pose a serious risk to participants. Remember the Milgram experiment where the participants thought they were giving electric shocks to another person for giving incorrect answers with increasing voltages? Well, they really weren't doing it. It was just an elaborate deception to conceal the true goal of the experiment, which is a study on the limits of obedience. The deception study that I ran when I was a PhD student was using a crowdsourcing platform to hire other crowdsourcers to write emails to their ex-girlfriend or to their old boss and say something using somebody else's email account. But it was all under our control. But you can see here that it could have long-term effects. Now, at the end, we had a debriefing statement that talked about what happened in the experiment, which the Milgram experiment didn't have. There weren't any actual shocks in the Milgram experiment, but it caused a lot of distress for the participants. Here's one that's important, and it's gaining importance as we have more and more data that's collected and put in different locations. So it used to be long ago that everything was on paper and you just lock it in a drawer. But now we have Google Drive, which is on the cloud. And if you have any Google Forms or spreadsheets, we need to illustrate that in section 6. I do a lot of surveys with Qualtrics, and Qualtrics has a database. There's information stored on some server with Qualtrics, and I need to mention that that information is stored in a location that's password protected. If there's any data that's stored on a researcher's computer, we need to make sure it's password protected, and we need to indicate that no others are going to be using the computer if that's the case. It's a good idea to anonymize data, especially participants' names. So it's a good idea to do that and discuss it in section 6. So for example, instead of using their names, replace it with an ID number. If there's an ID number, it's considered anonymized, especially if it's in some kind of sequential order. In section 7, we need to give information about our human subjects training. So look here, it asks for training within the last 3 years. Now, I have to say that at my institution in Northern Colorado, there is no requirement that it has to be 3 years old or less, because my certification is longer than 3 years ago. So if the training was completed on different dates, put the oldest date here. The next section requires signatures, because you need signatures from both the principal investigator as well as the faculty sponsor. In an HCI project, the sponsor will be the supervising professor. In a class project, the sponsor will likely be the instructor. This means that the PI has to ask the sponsor for their signature with enough time for them to read and send corrections back. This is not something you do the day before you submit. It's something you do that allows the supervisor or the sponsor for time to read and give suggestions on corrections. We also may have other documents we want to include, such as our informed consent letter. So there's a template that's given with in-document instructions on how to fill this out. Essentially, it's information about the research or the investigation, and it's nothing too different than what was asked in the research protocol. It's just done in a different format. If the research involves children, or there are going to be audio or video recordings of the research, then there's additional consent form templates that need to be customized. Next is the recruitment script. This is the message that would be distributed in order to recruit participants. So if it's done by email, this would be the body of the message. On Blackboard, there's a basic template to aid in the creation of this script. There's also a debriefing script. So after they complete the experiment, they need to be debriefed on what the purpose of the research was, why it was important to have them as participants, and if there's any deception, what was the real purpose of the experiment. So when I did a deception study, I had to tell them that this was purely a test to see whether they would go through and follow the directions, even though it might have been morally questionable. So the debriefing script or document needs to make sure that all participants are given the same information, they're debriefed in the same way. And remember, this is one thing that the Milgram experiment didn't do. So that's why it's important to have this, because you don't want long-term consequences for your participants in the study. Next, you want to include any kind of questionnaires and surveys, and this has to be attached for the committee to look at and review. So if there was a questionnaire, all the questions and alternatives must be included. If there's a post-participation survey, it should be included, and be aware that the data collected should be compatible with what we talked about in the data security plan. I hope this has been informative about research protocols, and I wish you luck as you create your very first one. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.